If you're watching this right now, it means something important has already happened. It means this message was not supposed to reach you, but it did anyway. I'm not surprised. I have learned that when you speak honestly about power, about systems, about the forces that quietly shape our lives, there will always be attempts to silence you. Sometimes it is done politely, through warnings and suggestions. Sometimes it is done openly, through pressure and threats. And sometimes it is done with a single click, erasing your words, deleting your story, hoping you will disappear. But I did not disappear, and I will not stop speaking. Because what I am about to tell you is not just my story. It is the story of millions of people who were told to stay quiet. It is the story of nations taught to accept dependency as destiny. It is the story of anyone who was warned not to ask certain questions. My name is Ibrahim Traoré. I am speaking to you not as a hero and not as a symbol, but as a witness to what happens behind closed doors, a witness to how pressure is applied, how obedience is rewarded, and how truth becomes dangerous. A witness who was given a choice: remain silent and be safe, or speak honestly and pay the price. I chose the truth, not because it was easy, not because it was safe, but because silence costs more than courage ever will. Let me tell you why voices like this are erased. Let me tell you how the system truly works, not as it is presented, but as it is practiced. And let me tell you why, even now, the truth continues to find its way through. When I first stepped into leadership, I was not prepared for how quickly illusions fall apart. I was young, barely into my 30s, a military officer suddenly responsible for a nation facing insecurity, poverty, and pressure from every direction. There was no transition period, no time to adjust. One day you are taking orders. The next day, every decision you make carries the weight of millions of lives. That is when I learned something most people are never taught. Real power does not always wear a uniform. It does not always stand behind a podium or sign documents on camera. Real power prefers to remain unseen. It lives in contracts no one reads aloud, in agreements written in technical language designed to confuse rather than inform, in closed meetings where decisions are made long before the public debate ever begins. During my first days in office, I was handed stacks of documents to approve. Some were routine, others were urgent, but a few demanded attention. They involved foreign companies, foreign banks, and long-term commitments that would shape our future for decades. I asked questions. Why were our resources sold at prices far below their value? Why were interest rates structured to keep us paying long after the original loans were spent? Why were decisions about our land, our security, and our economy made with so little accountability? The answers were always delivered calmly, confidently, and without hesitation. This is how the world works. This is normal. Everyone agrees to these terms. And then came the warning, sometimes subtle, sometimes direct. If you resist, you will be isolated. If you speak openly, you will be labeled irresponsible. If you try to change the rules, you will not last. That was the moment I understood something critical. I was not confronting individual decisions. I was confronting a system designed to reward compliance and punish independence. A system that decides which voices are amplified and which are erased. A system that does not need violence when it controls information. This is the system that fears transparency. This is the system that quietly deletes inconvenient truths. And this is the system that does not want you to understand how deeply it reaches into everyday life. But once you see it, you cannot unsee it. One of the greatest myths ever sold to developing nations is the idea that poverty is natural, that some countries are simply unlucky, that some people are destined to struggle, that wealth appears in certain places by chance and disappears from others for the same reason. This is not true. In my country, the land is rich, gold runs beneath our soil. Other resources lie waiting, quietly, patiently. Yet for decades, the people have remained poor. I wanted to understand why. I studied the contracts. I read the clauses hidden in footnotes. I examined the terms that were never explained to the public. The pattern was always the same. Foreign companies arrived with promises of development. They extracted the resources. They exported the wealth. And in return, we received a fraction of what was taken. The agreements were written to appear fair, but they were carefully engineered. Royalty rates were low. Penalties for renegotiation were severe. Arbitration courts were located far from our borders. Any attempt to revise the terms was framed as hostility toward investment. If we questioned the arrangement, we were warned of consequences. Legal action, economic retaliation, isolation from international financial systems. Debt played its role as well. Loans were offered as assistance, but designed as leverage. Interest accumulated quietly. Conditions multiplied. Years passed, governments changed, but the debt remained. Generation after generation was asked to repay obligations they never agreed to. Meanwhile, I visited villages where children watched trucks carrying gold past their homes. Trucks that brought no schools, no hospitals, no clean water with them. I saw farmers work land that could feed a nation, yet struggled to feed their own families. When I asked why this was accepted for so long, I received the same response again and again. There is no alternative. But there is always an alternative. The system simply depends on you believing there is not. The moment we began questioning these arrangements, resistance followed, not only from corporations, but from governments, institutions, and voices that claimed neutrality while defending the status quo. Suddenly, we were described as unstable. Suddenly, our leadership was portrayed as reckless. Suddenly, concern replaced cooperation. And when we tried to explain this reality to our people, something strange happened. The message struggled to travel. The story was reframed, and sometimes it disappeared entirely. At first, I believed in good faith. When interviews failed to air, I assumed there had been scheduling issues. When articles were shortened or reframed, I thought it was a matter of editing. When speeches received little attention, I blamed the noise of a crowded world. But patterns reveal truths that excuses cannot hide. I began to notice how certain stories traveled freely, while others struggled to exist at all. How some narratives were amplified instantly, while others were quietly buried. How criticism flowed in one direction, but understanding was carefully limited. This is not coincidence. Modern power does not rely on censorship alone. It relies on saturation, distraction, and selective visibility. It decides what appears on your screen, how long it stays there, and how quickly it disappears. When I spoke about renegotiating contracts, the focus shifted away from substance and toward fear. When I talked about sovereignty, the conversation was redirected toward instability. When I addressed the long-term cost of dependency, headlines framed it as defiance. Words were not debated, they were reinterpreted. And then came silence. Interviews that were recorded but never released. Statements quoted without context. Videos that failed to reach audiences they were intended for. It became clear that the issue was not accuracy. The issue was permission. Some truths are allowed because they do not threaten existing arrangements. Others are inconvenient because they force people to ask uncomfortable questions. And questions are dangerous. They lead people to ask who benefits. They lead people to notice patterns. They lead people to imagine alternatives. So instead of arguing against the message, the system reduces its visibility. Instead of confrontation, it chooses omission. Instead of debate, it chooses erasure. But silence is never neutral. Silence protects whoever already holds power. Silence maintains comfort. Silence preserves imbalance. That is why telling the truth now carries a different kind of cost. Not only criticism, but invisibility. Yet even invisibility has limits, because truth does not need permission to exist. It only needs someone willing to speak, and someone willing to listen. Speaking honestly does not only change how others see you, it changes how the world responds to you. Pressure does not always arrive loudly. Often it comes dressed as concern, as advice, as warnings delivered with calm voices and polite language. Meetings are postponed. Invitations quietly disappear. Partnerships become under review. Then the tone shifts. You are described as uncooperative, as unpredictable, as a risk. Private messages arrive late at night, not always threatening, but never accidental. They remind you of what you could lose: stability, support, safety. And you are given a choice. Lower your voice. Adjust your message. Choose your words more carefully, because the truth, they say, must be managed. There were nights when I asked myself if it was worth it. Not out of fear, but exhaustion. The cost of honesty is not paid once. It is paid repeatedly, in isolation, in misunderstanding, in the constant awareness that every word will be examined for weakness. It would have been easier to compromise quietly, to keep certain conversations behind closed doors, to accept partial progress in exchange for silence. But every compromise carries a message, and that message is always heard by those with the least power. When leaders choose comfort, ordinary people pay the price. I could not forget the faces of families who had no alternative, of workers whose labor built wealth they would never touch, of children whose future depended on decisions made far away from them. Silence would have made me safer, but it would have made them invisible. And I refuse to build stability on invisibility. Truth has a cost, but silence has a consequence. And consequences, once passed on, are far harder to undo. Power is often misunderstood. Many believe it belongs to those with titles, influence, or wealth. But the longer I have listened, the clearer the truth has become. Real power lives elsewhere. It lives in classrooms without electricity, where teachers continue to teach because knowledge matters more than comfort. It lives in clinics with limited supplies, where doctors refuse to turn people away, even when resources are scarce. It lives in markets and workshops, where young people build businesses with nothing but skill, patience, and belief. These people are not celebrated. They are rarely interviewed. Their stories do not trend, yet they are the reason change remains possible. I have walked through communities that were expected to collapse and watched them rebuild instead. I have seen neighbors protect one another across differences that were meant to divide them. I have witnessed resilience where the system predicted surrender. This is the kind of resistance that cannot be easily controlled, not because it is loud, but because it is rooted. The system understands force, it understands pressure, but it struggles to defeat quiet determination repeated every day. That is why distraction is so valuable. If people can be convinced that their neighbors are the enemy, they stop questioning those who benefit from division. If fear can be amplified, unity becomes suspicious. If outrage can be manufactured, clarity becomes rare. I have seen how narratives are shaped to turn differences into weapons, how identity is used to replace solidarity, how exhaustion is used to replace hope. But I have also seen the opposite. Communities that refuse to be divided, families that share what little they have, young people who choose creation over resentment. These choices may seem small, they are not. They form the foundation of every lasting transformation, and they remind us of something the system prefers. We forget, it only appears powerful because so many believe they are powerless. Every system that depends on imbalance shares the same weakness. It must convince people that it cannot be changed. Fear is the tool it relies on most. Fear of losing comfort, fear of being isolated, fear of being labeled irresponsible, dangerous, or ungrateful. Fear works best when it feels reasonable. You are told that resistance is reckless, that questioning authority invites chaos, that stability, even when unfair, is better than uncertainty. And slowly, fear becomes discipline. People learn which questions are acceptable, which truths are safe, which conversations should remain private. Division strengthens this process. When people are encouraged to distrust one another, they stop looking upward. When identities are weaponized, solidarity becomes fragile. When conflict is constant, exhaustion replaces courage. This is not accidental. A divided society is easier to manage than a united one. A fearful population is easier to guide than an informed one. But fear has limits. It can delay change, but it cannot prevent it forever. Because fear requires belief, and belief fades when reality becomes unbearable. Every system presents itself as permanent, as inevitable, as the only possible arrangement. History tells a different story. No unjust structure collapses because of a single speech or a single protest. It collapses when enough people quietly stop believing its promises, when obedience no longer feels moral, when silence no longer feels safe, when truth becomes more compelling than comfort. The moment people realize a system is fragile, it begins to weaken, not from attack, but from awareness. And awareness, once awakened, does not return to sleep easily. Truth rarely arrives loudly. More often, it begins as discomfort, as a question that refuses to disappear, as a quiet realization that something you were taught no longer makes sense. This is why truth is feared. It does not need permission. It does not ask for approval. Once recognized, it reshapes how everything else is seen. That is why attempts to erase it never fully succeed. A story can be deleted, a voice can be limited, but understanding, once formed, cannot be undone. I have learned that every act of honesty matters. Every question asked weakens a false certainty. Every refusal to remain silent creates space for someone else to speak. Change does not begin with crowds. It begins with individuals who decide to think differently. A student who asks why. A worker who refuses corruption. A parent who teaches their child to value truth over comfort. A leader who remembers that authority is a responsibility, not a privilege. These moments rarely make headlines, yet they shape the future more than any announcement ever could. Hope is often misunderstood as optimism. It is not. Hope is discipline. It is the decision to act with integrity even when outcomes are uncertain. It is the refusal to surrender agency simply because resistance is difficult. This is the power the system underestimates. Not anger, but persistence. Not noise, but clarity. Not blind opposition, but informed courage. And once people begin to recognize this power in themselves, the system loses its most valuable advantage: belief. I do not speak only about what is broken. I speak about what can be built. A future does not emerge by accident. It is shaped by choices, repeated, reinforced, and protected over time. I see a nation where resources serve the people who live on the land, not interests that never set foot on it. Where children are educated not to memorize obedience, but to understand possibility. Where progress is measured not only in numbers, but in dignity. I see institutions that exist to protect, not to extract. Leaders who listen more than they speak. Systems that reward contribution, not compliance. This future does not belong to one country alone. It depends on communities that refuse division, on nations that cooperate rather than compete for approval, on people who understand that sovereignty is not isolation and solidarity is not weakness. Responsibility cannot be outsourced. Governments carry responsibility, but so do citizens. Institutions influence outcomes, but individuals shape culture. Change requires leadership, but it survives through participation. If you wait for permission, it will never arrive. If you wait for perfect conditions, they will never appear. Every generation is given a choice: to maintain what is familiar or to build what is just. The future is not decided by those who benefit most from the present. It is decided by those willing to challenge it. I want to leave you with a challenge, not a slogan, not a demand, a decision. In the next 24 hours, do one thing that moves you closer to truth. Ask a question you have avoided. Speak a truth you have softened for comfort. Refuse an action that depends on someone else's silence. Do not wait for permission. Do not wait for applause. Change never begins that way. If you see injustice, do not look away because it is easier. If you see suffering, do not accept comfort as an excuse. If you know the truth, do not bury it to protect convenience. And when you speak, speak with integrity. Not to provoke, but to clarify. Not to divide, but to awaken. This message is not important because it carries my name. It matters because it carries a reminder. Silence is a choice, and so is courage. They may erase a video. They may limit its reach. They may try to reduce it to noise. But understanding cannot be deleted. If you are still listening, it means the story continues. And now, it includes you. Every time truth is spoken, the world shifts. Quietly, steadily, irreversibly.